People often think of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson as a titan of American crime, a figure carved from the hard granite of Harlem's underworld, a ruler who commanded fear and respect in equal measure. But behind the legend of the Godfather of Harlem, behind the cinematic portrayals by Lawrence Fishburne and Forrest Whitaker, there was a man who woke up every morning, put on his clothes, ate his breakfast, and navigated the mundane complexities of a life lived on the razor's edge of the law. So what did Bumpy Johnson actually do all day? Not just the high-stakes negotiations with the Italian Mafia or the violent confrontations that made headlines, but the small things, the conversations, the meals, the quiet moments of strategy and reflection that defined his existence. Was he constantly plotting turf wars, or was his daily life a more intricate tapestry of community management, intellectual pursuit, and survival? To understand the real Bumpy Johnson, we must look past the Hollywood gloss and examine the historical record, viewing him not just as a gangster, but through the lens of the classical archetypes he so often mirrored: the strategist, the estate manager, and the exiled hero returning home. In the grand tapestry of history, figures like Bumpy Johnson often exist in the gray areas between myth and reality. Much like the heroes of antiquity, his life has been filtered through oral traditions, sensationalized news reports, and the memories of those who knew him. He was a man of contradictions, a violent enforcer who wrote poetry, a drug trafficker who funded scholarships, a criminal who staged sit-down strikes for civil rights. To truly understand his daily routine, we must strip away the veneer of the gangster and look at him as a manager of a vast and dangerous estate, a role that the ancient Greek historian Xenophon described as requiring the highest levels of self-discipline, foresight, and the ability to wield authority. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on October 31, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina. His early life was marked by the same forces that shaped the classical hero's adversity and displacement. Born with a slight deformation of his skull, a bump on the back of his head that earned him his lifelong moniker, he was marked from the beginning as different. This physical distinction, much like the scars of Odysseus or the distinct features of Socrates, became part of his identity. His childhood in the segregated South was a crucible. When he was just 10 years old, his older brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. Fearing the brutal and arbitrary justice of the Jim Crow South, a wrath not unlike the capricious anger of the gods in Greek mythology, his parents mortgaged their home to send Willie north. As Johnson grew, his own temper and refusal to submit to the insolence of white authority made him a target. In 1919, seeking safety and a future, he was sent to live with his sister Mabel in Harlem. This migration was not merely a change of address, it was a shift into a new world, a Great Migration, that saw hundreds of thousands of African Americans moving to urban centers, creating new city-states of culture and commerce. Harlem was his Ithaca, a place where he would have to carve out his identity. But unlike the returning king, Johnson arrived as an outsider, a young man with a thick Southern accent and a short stature who was immediately picked on by the local children. It is here that the formation of his character began. Instead of submitting, he fought back. He developed a reputation as a scrapper, a fighter who would not be intimidated. This refusal to be subjugated is reminiscent of the Cynic philosophers, particularly Diogenes, who, when mocked and called a dog, embraced the title and used it to bite back at a society that rejected him. Johnson, the Bumpy Kid from Charleston, began to cultivate a fearsome persona that would become his armor and his weapon. He dropped out of high school, but he did not drop out of learning. He began working casual jobs, sweeping storefronts, selling newspapers, and hustling pool. It was in these streets that he met William "Bub" Hewlett, a gangster who recognized something in the young Johnson. When Johnson refused to back down from Hewlett over a territorial dispute regarding a storefront, Hewlett saw not insolence, but potential. He invited Johnson into the fold, not as a servant, but as a protector of the high-profile numbers bankers of Harlem. This was his entry into the state management of the underworld. To understand Bumpy Johnson's daily life during his rise, we must look at his relationship with Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary queen of policy rackets. By the time Johnson was in his late 20s, he had already spent nearly half his life in prison for various offenses, including burglary and pimping. When he was released in 1932, destitute and looking for a way forward, he aligned himself with St. Clair. She was a woman of immense power and intellect, a leader who controlled a vast economic network. She needed an enforcer, a guardian of the law, for her illicit empire, and she found it in Johnson. Their partnership can be analyzed through the lens of Xenophon's The Estate Manager, which describes the ideal partnership between those who manage the interior and those who managed the exterior. Xenophon writes that the gods acted with discernment in pairing partners to ensure the best for their shared interests, assigning indoor tasks to one and outdoor tasks to the other, creating a mutual dependency that strengthens the whole. St. Clair was the indoor manager, the intellect, and the administrator who ran the numbers, managed the books, and navigated the political landscape. Johnson was the door manager, the one endowed with the physical capacity to endure cold, heat, and conflict, the one responsible for defense and enforcement. In his daily routine during the 1930s, Johnson was not merely a thug, he was a strategic partner in a war against encroachment. The German Jewish mobster Dutch Schultz had moved into Harlem, attempting to take over the numbers racket through violence and intimidation. This conflict was not a simple turf war, it was an invasion. We can draw parallels here to the late Bronze Age and the phenomenon of the Sea Peoples, raiders who disrupted established powers and economies through asymmetrical warfare. Dutch Schultz's forces were like the invading armies, backed by the resources of a larger syndicate. St. Clair and Johnson, however, waged a guerrilla war. Johnson's daily life became a series of tactical maneuvers. He was the admiral of a fleet of swift-faring ships, in this case, his crew of 9 loyal men, conducting hit and run attacks on Schultz's operations. Johnson's days were filled with the logistics of this war. He had to ensure his men were equipped, motivated, and loyal. As Xenophon notes in The Estate Manager, a leader must make his subordinates loyal by sharing in the benefits of good fortune and by being a benefactor. Johnson did exactly this. He was known for his generosity, providing protection and resources to his crew and the community. He understood that loyalty was the currency of the underworld. His war against Schultz resulted in over 40 murders and numerous kidnappings, a brutal campaign that eventually forced the Italian Mafia to the negotiating table. When Schultz was assassinated in 1935, a hit ordered by Lucky Luciano, not Johnson, though Johnson's resistance had made Schultz a liability, the landscape of Harlem changed. Clair withdrew from the active leadership of the rackets, leaving her state in Johnson's hands. Bumpy Johnson negotiated a peace with the Italians, a deal that allowed him to control the Harlem rackets in exchange for a cut of the profits paid to the Genovese crime family. This was a watershed moment. For the first time, a black crime boss was not a subordinate, but a partner, negotiating terms with the most powerful criminal organization in the country. From this point on, Bumpy Johnson's daily life shifted from that of a wartime general to that of a governor. He was now the King of Harlem, a title that carried with it immense administrative responsibilities. His routine settled into a pattern that, while illicit, mirrored the duties of any high-ranking estate manager or city official. He held court. He managed disputes. He oversaw the distribution of resources. His mornings often began late, a habit common among those whose business is conducted in the shadows of the night. But even in his leisure, there was a discipline to his actions. He was an avid reader, a man who consumed history and philosophy with the same voracious appetite he had for power. Sources tell us he read Shakespeare and Nietzsche, intellectuals who grapple with the nature of power and the human condition. This was not an affectation, it was a tool. Johnson understood that to rule men, one must understand them. He wrote poetry, some of which was published during the Harlem Renaissance, revealing a sensitivity that stood in stark contrast to his violent reputation. This duality is central to understanding his daily existence. He was a philosopher gangster, a man who could discuss the nuances of literature in the morning and order a man's death in the afternoon. In the television series Godfather of Harlem, this is depicted through his interactions with figures like Malcolm X, where Johnson debates the morality of his actions. While the show fictionalizes conversations, the core truth remains Johnson was an intellectual who operated in a brutal world. He was in many ways a cynic philosopher of the streets, like Diogenes, who walked through the world with a staff and a cloak, challenging the social norms and barking at the hypocrisy of the powerful. Johnson moved through Harlem with a distinct style and a refusal to bow to external authority. His office was the street, the barbershop, the restaurant. He spent his days visible to his subjects, much like Socrates, who was always in the public eye, walking the covered colonnades and the recreation grounds of Athens. Johnson would be seen at Wells' Restaurant, a famous Harlem establishment, where he would hold court, eating chicken and waffles, taking meetings, and dispensing justice. This visibility was a calculated part of his power. He was not a distant ruler hiding in a fortress, he was a presence. He was accessible. If you wanted to open a numbers spot on the avenue, you went to see Bumpy. If you wanted to convert a brownstone into a speakeasy, you checked with Bumpy first. His management style can be likened to the ideal foreman described by Aeschymachus in Xenophon's dialogue. A good foreman must be loyal, responsible, and capable of wielding authority. He must know how to reward good workers and punish bad ones. Johnson's workers were the numbers runners, the enforcers, and the dealers. He demanded absolute loyalty and competence. He knew that a business, criminal or legitimate, could not function if the people running it were drunkards or ruled by sleep. He maintained a strict order. Those who crossed him or failed him were dealt with severely. The story of Ulysses Rawlins, who challenged Johnson and was left with his eyeball dangling from its socket, serves as a gruesome reminder of the consequences of insubordination. Johnson, after the act, reportedly coolly remarked that he had a sudden craving for spaghetti and meatballs, a chilling display of the detachment required to wield such violence. Yet his days were also filled with acts of philanthropy. He was known as the Robin Hood of Harlem. He paid for children's tuitions, distributed turkeys on Thanksgiving, and threw annual Christmas parties. This was not just charity, it was a mechanism of control and legitimacy. By providing for the community where the state had failed, he secured the loyalty of the people. He was filling the vacuum of governance, acting as a local king who ensured the welfare of his subjects in exchange for their silence and support. This mirrors the ancient concept of euergetism, where wealthy individuals in Greek and Roman cities would distribute food and fund public works to maintain their status and social order. Johnson understood that his power rested not just on violence, but on the consent, or at least the gratitude, of the governed. In 1948, his personal life took a turn towards stability when he met Mamie Hatcher. They met in a restaurant in April and were married by October. Mamie became his partner, his confidante, and the chronicler of his life. Their marriage was a partnership in the truest sense. While she was not involved in the violent details of his work, she managed the domestic sphere and provided the stability he needed to operate. Xenophon's estate manager devotes considerable time to the training of a wife to manage the household, arguing that the indoor and outdoor domains are complementary. Mame Johnson's later writings reveal that she knew exactly who her husband was. She did not shy away from his reality, but she also saw the man behind the myth, the man who loved reading newspapers, who was a fan of television programs, and who maintained close ties with his family. However, the outdoor domain of Johnson's life was fraught with peril. The police were a constant presence in his day. He was arrested over 40 times in his life. His daily routine involved a constant game of cat and mouse with law enforcement. He had to be hyper-aware of surveillance, careful with his words, and strategic in his movements. In 1952, this game came to a temporary end. Johnson was indicted for drug conspiracy. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. This marked the beginning of his exile. He was sent to Alcatraz, the infamous island prison in San Francisco Bay. For a man who ruled the streets of Harlem, this was a descent into the underworld. In the Odyssey, the hero Odysseus is kept from his home for years, trapping him in a state of suspended animation, far from the estate he is meant to manage. For Johnson, Alcatraz was his ogygia, his island of detention. Yet even here, the legends persist. It is rumored that he helped organize the famous escape of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers in 1962, allegedly using his connections to secure a boat for them. Whether true or not, the story fits the archetype of the wily hero, the man of many turns polytropos who can navigate any trap. Unlike the escapees, however, Johnson served his time. He chose to finish his sentence rather than live as a fugitive, perhaps realizing, like Socrates in the Credo, that to flee would be to admit guilt or weakness, or perhaps simply calculating that his return to power required a legitimate release. He returned to Harlem in 1963. His homecoming, his Nostos, was greeted with a parade. The community came out to welcome him, a testament to the deep roots he had established. But the Harlem he returned to was changing. The civil rights movement was in full swing. The drug trade had evolved. The Italian Mafia had tightened its grip. Johnson, now an older man, had to re-establish his authority in a new world. It was in this twilight era that his relationship with Malcolm X became most significant. They had known each other since the 1940s when Malcolm was Detroit Red, a street hustler. Now, Malcolm was a global icon of black empowerment. Johnson provided protection for Malcolm after he split from the Nation of Islam, recognizing the danger his old friend was in. This relationship highlights the complexity of Johnson's character. He was a criminal, yes, but he was also a man with a distinct code of honor and a consciousness of his racist struggle. He cut ties with Malcolm only when he felt his presence would tarnish the leader's image, a selfless act of strategic withdrawal. In December 1965, Johnson's frustration with the constant police harassment boiled over. He staged a sit-down strike at a police station, refusing to leave. This was an act of civil disobedience worthy of a protest leader, yet it was performed by a mob boss. He was charged with refusal to leave a police station, a charge he was later acquitted of. This incident reveals a man who, even in his later years, refused to be cowed by authority. He was asserting his right to exist in his own city on his own terms. By 1968, Johnson was under federal indictment again, this time for a drug conspiracy. His health was failing. On the night of July 7, 1968, he followed his routine one last time. He went to Wells' restaurant in the early hours of the morning. He ordered his favorite meal, chicken leg, hominy grits, and coffee. It was a simple, comforting meal, eaten in the heart of the territory he had ruled for decades. There, surrounded by friends, his heart gave out. He died as he had lived, in Harlem, a king in his own domain. Bumpy Johnson's life was a testament to the power of will and organization. He was a truly good estate manager in the Xenophontic sense, capable, responsible, and effective, applied to an illicit and dangerous industry. He was a warrior who fought for his territory with the ruthlessness of a Bronze Age raider. He was a philosopher who sought wisdom in books while navigating the treachery of the streets. To understand what he did all day is to understand the relentless labor of maintaining power in a world designed to strip it away. To comprehend the daily life of the man who would become the godfather of Harlem, we must first examine the crucible in which his character was forged. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on All Hallows Eve, October 31, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina. From his very first breath, he was marked by physical distinction, a deformation of the skull that created a noticeable bump on the back of his head. In the ancient world, physical anomalies were often interpreted as omens, marking a child for a destiny that deviated from the ordinary. For Odysseus, it was a scar on his thigh. For Ellsworth, it was this bump, a feature that would grant him the moniker Bumpy, a name that would one day strike fear into the hearts of men far more powerful than the boy from Charleston. His early existence in the Jim Crow South was defined by the precariousness of life, a theme resonant with the fragility of the human condition described in the Homeric epics. The Johnson family was not poor by the standards of the day, but they were black in a society where the color of one's skin could be a death sentence. The pivotal moment of his youth, his own casus belli, occurred when he was just 10 years old. His older brother, Willie, was accused of killing a white man. The subsequent terror that gripped the family mirrors the dread of a city under siege in the Iliad. To save Willie from the capricious and often fatal justice of a lynch mob, his parents mortgaged their home, sacrificing their material security for the life of their son, sending him north. But the young Ellsworth was not cowed by this atmosphere of terror. Rather, it instilled in him a defiance that would define his daily actions for the rest of his life. As he grew, his temper became a liability in the South. He refused to lower his eyes or step off the sidewalk for white pedestrians, violating the unwritten, tyrannical laws of his environment. Recognizing that this hubris, in the eyes of the white establishment, would inevitably lead to his destruction, his parents made the decision in 1919 to send him away. Like many heroes of antiquity sent into exile for their own protection or as punishment for blood, guilt, Johnson was sent to live with his sister Mabel in Harlem. He arrived in New York City at the height of the Great Migration, a massive movement of people that transformed the urban landscape of America, much like the migrations of the Sea Peoples transformed the Mediterranean in the Late Bronze Age. But Harlem was not immediately a promised land for the young Bumpy. He was an outsider, short of stature, with a thick Southern accent that marked him as different. The local children, the established citizens of this new city-state mocked him. They attacked him. It is here that we see the emergence of a philosophy that parallels the Cynic tradition of ancient Greece. The Cynics, particularly Diogenes of Sinope, were known for their shamelessness, their endurance, and their refusal to abide by arbitrary social conventions. When Diogenes was mocked and called a dog, he embraced the title, biting at his detractors and living by his own natural code. Johnson, too, embraced his otherness. He did not retreat, he fought. He carried a knife in his shoe, a hidden weapon like the trickery of Odysseus, and he learned to use it. His daily routine as a teenager became a series of skirmishes for respect. He learned that in the lawless vacuum of the streets, authority is not granted, it is taken. His education was not confined to the schoolhouse. In fact, he dropped out of high school, rejecting the formal payday of the establishment for the practical education of the street. He worked menial jobs, sweeping floors, selling newspapers. But these were merely covers for his true vocation: survival and dominance. By the time he was in his 20s, his curriculum included armed robbery, extortion, and pimping. He spent nearly half of his young adulthood in prisons, institutions that served as his own personal academy. In Xenophon's memoirs, Socrates discusses the nature of high-spirited youths. He notes that the best-bred horses are often the most spirited and impetuous. If they are broken in when young, they become the most useful and magnificent of creatures, but if they remain unbroken, they become wild, unmanageable, and dangerous. Bumpy Johnson was that high-spirited steed. The penal system did not break him, it honed him. It taught him the patience of a predator and the stoicism of a philosopher. He emerged from these confinements not rehabilitated in the state's eyes, but refined in his own, a dangerous weapon waiting for a hand steady enough to wield it. There is a pervasive misconception that the gangster is inherently a creature of brute force, devoid of intellect. Bumpy Johnson shatters this archetype. His daily life was a duality, a constant oscillation between the violence of his trade and the refinement of his mind. While his hands were stained with the grit of the underworld, his mind was often occupied with the sublime. Johnson was a voracious reader. Historical accounts confirm that he consumed history and philosophy, and he was known to quote Shakespeare and Nietzsche. This intellectualism was not a mere affectation, it was a strategic asset. In Xenophon's memoirs, Socrates converses with Euthydemus, a young man who has collected many books, but has not yet learned how to use them to become a leader. Socrates argues that the possession of books is useless without the wisdom to apply their lessons to the management of the state. Johnson understood this Socratic principle instinctively. He read not to stockpile trivia, but to understand the mechanics of power, the motivations of men, and the cycles of history. He was active during the Harlem Renaissance, a period of explosion in black art and culture. Bumpy was not just a spectator to this, he was a participant. He wrote poetry, some of which was published in Harlem magazines. This artistic sensitivity stands in stark contrast to his reputation as an enforcer. Yet, looking at the classical tradition, this combination of warrior and poet is not contradictory. Achilles sang the glories of men while playing the lyre in his tent. Solon, the lawgiver of Athens, wrote poetry to justify his political reforms. Johnson's poetry was his release, a way to process the double consciousness of being a black man in America, a concept articulated by W.E.B. Du Bois but lived daily by Bumpy. His daily routine often involved holding court at places like Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue. Here he acted as a perverse sort of Socratic figure. Like Socrates in the Agora, Bumpy was a fixture of the public space. He would sit, eat his chicken and waffles, and engage with the people. But where Socrates questioned citizens to expose their ignorance, Bumpy questioned them to gauge their loyalty and utility. He played chess, a game of strategy that mirrors the tactical maneuvering of warfare. It is said he even played against Lucky Luciano, the architect of the modern American Mafia. This image, the black gangster and the Italian Don facing off over a chessboard outside the YMCA, is a potent symbol of Bumpy's standing. He was not a subordinate, he was a peer in the realm of strategy. We can analyze his demeanor through the lens of Stoicism, a philosophy that Donald Robertson notes was deeply influenced by the Cynic tradition and the myth of Hercules. The Stoic ideal is apatheia, not apathy in the modern sense, but a freedom from unruly passions, a composure in the face of fortune. Bumpy Johnson was legendary for his cool detachment. In the midst of gang wars, police harassment, and prison stints, he maintained a bumpy exterior, imperturbable and stoic. He did not act out of rash anger, he acted out of calculated necessity. When he flashed a knife or ordered a hit, it was a decision, not a reaction. In Godfather of Harlem, this side of him is dramatized in his interactions with Malcolm X. While the show takes liberties, the historical connection is real. Bumpy provided protection for Malcolm when the latter broke with the Nation of Islam. This relationship highlights Bumpy's recognition of true goodness, or kalakagetheia, the Greek ideal of the gentleman hero. Even if he could not embody this ideal fully in his own criminal life, he recognized it in Malcolm and sought to preserve it. Xenophon writes in the memoirs that Socrates believed the best natures, if uneducated, turn out the worst, but if trained, become the most useful. Bumpy perhaps saw in Malcolm the realization of the potential that had been twisted in himself by the necessities of survival. Johnson's education also involved the mastery of rhetoric. He could speak the language of the street, the language of the poet, and the language of the diplomat. This polytropic ability, the ability to turn and adapt like Odysseus, allowed him to navigate the distinct worlds of Harlem: the destitute poor, the jazz elite, the Italian mobsters, and the political activists. He was a man of many ways, and this versatility was the true source of his power. In 1932, Bumpy Johnson was released from prison broke and unemployed. It was in this desperate state that he formed the most significant partnership of his life with Stephanie St. Clair, known to all of Harlem as Madame Queen, or Queenie. St. Clair was a Martinique-born woman of fierce intelligence and indomitable will who had built a lucrative numbers empire in Harlem. To understand the daily mechanics of their partnership, we can turn to Xenophon's The Estate Manager Economicus. In this text, Ischomachus describes to Socrates the ideal division of labor between husband and wife, which functions as a metaphor for the management of any complex estate. The wife, or the indoor manager, is responsible for receiving the produce brought in from the outside, storing it, and distributing it. The husband, or the outdoor manager, is responsible for securing the resources, dealing with external threats, and enduring the elements. Stephanie St. Clair was the quintessential indoor manager. She was the brains of the operation. She understood the mathematics of the policy rackets, maintained the ledgers, and navigated the complex web of payoffs to police and politicians. She issued advertisements in newspapers decrying police corruption, a bold use of public rhetoric to defend her estate. Her role was to govern the internal economy of the organization, ensuring that the store chests were full and that the workers were paid. Bumpy Johnson became her outdoor manager. Xenophon writes that the outdoor manager must be endowed with the physical capacity to endure cold, heat, and conflict. He must be capable of capturing men and making them loyal. St. Clair needed an enforcer, a guardian of the laws she had established for her illicit kingdom. Bumpy, with his reputation for fearlessness and his proficiency with a knife, fitted this role perfectly. His daily duties in this period involved securing the territory. He was the foreman of her workforce. In The Estate Manager, Ischomachus explains that a good foreman must be loyal, capable of wielding authority, and able to reward and punish. Bumpy instilled loyalty in the numbers runners and lookouts not just through fear, but through competence. He showed them that he could protect them. When disputes arose on the street corners, the fields, of this estate, it was Bumpy who adjudicated them, often with swift violence. Their relationship was symbiotic. St. Clair provided the capital and the infrastructure. Johnson provided the muscle and the strategy for expansion. It was a partnership of mutual respect. Sources indicate that St. Clair was impressed by Bumpy's intellect as much as his brawn. He was not merely a hired thug, he was a consigliere in the making. He learned from her the art of the deal, how to negotiate, when to hold firm, and when to retreat. This period was Bumpy's apprenticeship in the high art of estate management. He learned that a criminal empire, like a farm or a household, requires order. Xenophon emphasizes that there is nothing in human life as useful or as fine as orderliness. A disorderly army is easily defeated. A disorderly ship cannot survive a storm. Bumpy brought order to the chaotic streets of Harlem. He organized the disparate crews, standardized the protection fees, and ensured that the machinery of the numbers racket ran smoothly. However, this order was soon threatened by an external force. The Jewish mobster Dutch Schultz, seeing the immense profits generated by the Harlem numbers game, decided to invade. This was not a mere business competition. It was an existential threat to St. Clair's estate, and it was here that Bumpy Johnson's role shifted from overseer to general. The conflict that erupted between the Harlem numbers bankers and Dutch Schultz in the early 1930s is often described as a gang war. However, viewed through the lens of ancient history, it bears a striking resemblance to the phenomenon of the Sea Peoples and the collapse of the Bronze Age palatial systems. Dutch Schultz represented the palatial power. He was backed by a massive, centralized organization with deep pockets, political connections, and a standing army of gunmen. He sought to impose a monopoly, to bring the independent states of Harlem's gambling rings under his singular imperial control. He demanded tribute and subjugation. Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson, by contrast, operated like the Sea Raiders. The Sheridan or the Looka described in the text Black Ships and Sea Raiders. They were agile, decentralized, and operated on the fringes of the established power structure. They could not meet Schultz's army in a pitched battle. Open warfare would have resulted in their annihilation, just as a small fleet of raiders could not defeat the Egyptian navy in a head-on collision. Instead, Bumpy Johnson adopted the tactics of asymmetric warfare. His daily life during this war was that of a guerrilla commander. He utilized the terrain of Harlem, his own Ithaca, to his advantage. He knew every alley, every rooftop, every cellar. Xenophon notes in Memoirs that a general must know the strength of his own country and that of his opponents. Bumpy knew that Schultz's men were outsiders, As Mamie Johnson wrote, picking off Dutch Schultz's men was easy since there were few other white men walking around Harlem during the day. Bumpy organized his crew, the 40 Thieves, into a fleet of urban raiders. They conducted hit-and-run attacks on Schultz's number spots. They intercepted his runners, seizing their cargo. The betting slips and money much like pirates seizing merchant vessels. The text Black Ships discusses how piracy and warfare were often indistinguishable in the ancient world, with one season's predator being another season's entrepreneur. Bumpy embodied this fluidity. He was a businessman when he could be, and a pirate when he had to be. The violence was brutal. Over 40 murders and numerous kidnappings were attributed to this conflict. Bumpy's days were filled with the logistics of slaughter, procuring weapons, scouting targets, and disposing of bodies. He had to be constantly vigilant, a trait Xenophon attributes to the good general, who must always post guards. Bumpy moved through the shadows, striking where the enemy was weak and vanishing before they could respond. But Bumpy was not just a warrior, he was a strategist. He understood that he could not win this war solely by attrition. He needed allies. He recognized that the Italian Mafia, specifically Lucky Luciano, viewed Schultz as a liability, a madman whose violent excesses drew too much heat. Bumpy engaged in diplomacy, positioning himself as a rational alternative to the chaotic Schultz. In 1935, the war came to an abrupt end. Dutch Schultz was assassinated not by Bumpy, but on the orders of the Mafia Commission. This was the moment of the peace with honor. Bumpy Johnson negotiated a treaty with Lucky Luciano. The deal was simple: the Italians would control the higher levels of the organization and take a cut, but the day-to-day operations in Harlem would remain in black hands, specifically Bumpy's hands. This was a watershed moment. Bumpy Johnson had successfully defended his state against a superior force. He had secured his borders and established his legitimacy. He was no longer just an enforcer, he was a ruler. Like a Bronze Age chieftain who has successfully repelled an invasion and secured a trade route, Bumpy now stood at the pinnacle of his power. He had transitioned from the Sheridan of the Sea, a chaotic, raiding force, to a settled king, ready to govern his domain. His daily life would now shift from the frenetic pace of war to the steady, watchful rhythm of governance. He had won the war, now he had to keep the peace. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, Bumpy Johnson had transitioned from the role of a wartime general to that of a settled administrator. He was no longer merely fighting for territory, he was governing it. To understand what he effectively did all day during this period, we must look past the sensationalism of gangster films and view him through the lens of Xenophon's The Estate Manager, Oikonomachus. In this Socratic dialogue, the ideal gentleman Ischomachus explains that the art of management is a distinct branch of knowledge, defined as knowing how to make use of assets so that they are profitable. Bumpy Johnson was, in the truest sense, the Oikonomos of Harlem, treating the criminal underworld not as a chaotic scramble for loot, but as a structured estate requiring constant, meticulous oversight. His daily routine was governed by the principle of orderliness taxis. Xenophon writes that there is nothing in human life as useful or as fine as orderliness, comparing a well-run household to a disciplined army where every soldier knows his place, or a ship where every piece of equipment is stowed so that it can be found instantly in a storm. Bumpy applied this rigorous discipline to the numbers racket. The policy banks were his granaries, the runners were his field hands, the controllers were his foremen. His day often began not with violence, but with logistics. The numbers game was a mathematical empire built on pennies and nickels, but aggregating to millions. Like Ischomachus instructing his wife on the organization of the household, Bumpy had to ensure that every slip was accounted for, every payout verified, and every bribe delivered on schedule. He understood, as Xenophon notes, that if people understand how to use these agents, they carry out their duties successfully. But if they do not, then they come to grief. Bumpy's agents were a complex network of community members, barbers, bartenders, maids, and street hustlers. He had to know their characters, their weaknesses, and their strengths. He practiced the art of training his subordinates, a key theme in The Estate Manager. Ischomachus argues that a good foreman must be taught loyalty, not just through fear but by sharing in the prosperity of the estate. Bumpy was famous for this. He didn't just pay wages, he paid tuitions, rents, and medical bills. He created a system of benefaction that bound his workers to him with ties of gratitude deeper than mere employment. He understood that a worker who feels a stake in the outcome is far more effective than a slave driven only by fear of punishment. When the police cracked down, Bumpy's people didn't talk. This silence was the fruit of his management style. He had instilled in them a sense of shared destiny, or what Xenophon calls friendliness and loyalty. However, Bumpy also understood the necessity of the master's eye. In a famous anecdote from the estate manager, a Persian king is asked what fattens a horse most quickly and replies, "The master's eye." Bumpy was omnipresent in Harlem. He did not rule from a distant fortress. He walked the streets. He checked the fields of his estate personally. If a numbers bank was short, Bumpy knew. If a runner was skimming, Bumpy knew. This visibility was a calculated management tactic. It ensured that his foremen, the lieutenants running specific blocks, knew that their work was being inspected. As Escamacus says, the master's eye is the most effective way of producing good work. Bumpy's physical presence served as both an inspiration to the loyal and a terrifying deterrent to the dishonest. His management extended to the handling of enemies as assets. Socrates argues in The Estate Manager that enemies too are assets for someone who is capable of deriving benefit from them. Bumpy's relationship with the Italian Mafia, particularly Lucky Luciano and later Frank Costello, exemplifies this. He did not view them solely as threats to be destroyed, but as powerful forces to be managed and utilized. He negotiated a percentage of the profits in exchange for peace and independence, effectively turning a potential war into a revenue stream. He managed the police in the same way, treating them not as implacable foes, but as another cost of doing business, a group to be placated with bribes, the fertilizer of his estate to ensure the crop, the illegal lottery, could be harvested without interruption. This daily grind of administration required immense self-discipline, or enkrateia. Xenophon emphasizes that a man cannot manage an estate if he is a slave to his own appetites. Bumpy was known for his cool demeanor, his refusal to be ruled by drugs or drink, even as he profited from them. He embodied the Socratic ideal of the ruler who must first rule himself before he can rule others. While many of his contemporaries flamed out in bursts of violence or addiction, Bumpy remained steady, treating his criminal enterprise with the sobriety of a judge and the diligence of a farmer tending his crops. He proved that even in the underworld, success depends less on brute force than on the xenophontic virtues of order, supervision, and the intelligent management of human resources. Bumpy Johnson was a paradox to those who only saw the violence of his profession, a killer who quoted Shakespeare, a mob boss who played chess with the nobility of the underworld. To understand his internal life and his daily demeanor, we must look to the philosophical traditions of antiquity, particularly the interplay between cynicism and stoicism, and the archetype of the philosopher king, who rules not by title, but by merit. Chess was a central part of Bumpy's daily ritual. He would often be seen playing outside the YMCA or at other public spots in Harlem, sometimes even engaging with Lucky Luciano over the board. This was not merely a pastime, it was a public display of strategic intellect. In the ancient world, board games like Patea were seen as training for war and logic. By playing chess in the open, Bumpy was asserting his equality with the Italian bosses. He was demonstrating that his power came not just from the knife or the gun, but from the mind. He was the wily Odysseus, the man of many turns polytropos, capable of outthinking opponents who possessed greater material resources. His personality aligned strikingly with the Stoic ideal of apatheia, not an absence of feeling, but a freedom from being enslaved by passions. Sources describe him as refined and classy, more like a businessman than a typical gangster. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. This aligns with the description of the Stoic sage who remains unperturbed by external circumstances. Even his nickname, Bumpy, which originated from a physical deformity, became a badge of identity rather than a source of shame, much like the cynic philosopher Diogenes embraced the insult of being called a dog. Bumpy did not hide his bump, he made the name legendary. We can draw a parallel here to the Hercules, mythos that was central to both Cynic and Stoic thought. The Cynics viewed Hercules not just as a brute, but as a hero of endurance and virtue who chose a life of hardship over easy pleasure. The famous choice of Hercules, recounted by Xenophon. Bumpy's life was a series of labors. He fought the monsters of poverty, racism, and rival gangs. He cleared the stables of Dutch Schultz's men. While his methods were criminal, his self-conception was likely that of a protector and a guardian of his community. He saw himself as clearing away injustice in his own domain, much like Epictetus describes Hercules purging the earth of bad men. Bumpy's reading habits further cement this image of the philosopher gangster. He was known to read history, philosophy, and literature. This intellectualism was a tool of his trade. He understood that to rule men, one must understand the human condition. In the Memorabilia, Xenophon's Socrates argues that the best leaders are those who know what they are doing. Bumpy knew. He studied the law, he studied history, and he studied his enemies. He applied the Socratic method of questioning to his underlings, testing their loyalty and their competence, ensuring that his state was run by those who knew their jobs. Furthermore, Bumpy's relationship with the Harlem community mirrored the cynic philosopher's relationship with society. He was an insider-outsider. He operated outside the law, yet he was the ultimate authority within his territory. Like Diogenes, who mocked Alexander the Great to his face, Bumpy refused to bow to the legitimate authorities, the white police and politicians, who he viewed as corrupt and hypocritical. He exposed the sham of their authority by establishing a counter-authority that was more effective, and in the eyes of many Harlemites, more just. He provided turkey dinners and coal for the poor, filling the vacuum left by the state, acting as a benefactor in the ancient tradition of euergetism. His stoicism was tested most severely during his many arrests and legal battles. He spent a significant portion of his life behind bars, yet he maintained his influence and his dignity. Epictetus writes that a man can be imprisoned, but his will remains free. Bumpy exemplified this. Prison could confine his body, but it could not break his spirit or his status. Even in chains, he remained a king in the eyes of his people, embodying the Stoic paradox that the wise man is free even when enslaved. Bumpy Johnson was not a saint, he was a violent criminal, but the ancients understood that great men often possess a terrifying capacity for both good and evil. He was a big man, in the historical sense, a figure who rose above the chaos through sheer force of will and intellect. He played the game of life like he played chess, calculating, patient, and ruthless when necessary, always maintaining the bumpy exterior that hid a mind constantly plotting the next move. In 1952, the carefully managed estate of Bumpy Johnson was thrown into chaos. He was indicted for drug conspiracy and sentenced to 15 years in prison. This event marked the beginning of his great exile, a period that can be mythologically framed as the hero's descent into the underworld, or Nikia. For a man who defined himself by his control over the streets of Harlem, removal to the isolation of Alcatraz was a symbolic death. He was stripped of his armor, his suits, his money, his entourage, and reduced to a number. Alcatraz, sitting on a rock in the middle of the cold San Francisco Bay, was his Ogygia, the island where the nymph Calypso detained Odysseus, keeping him from his home and his estate. Just as Odysseus sat by the shore weeping for Ithaca, Bumpy was cut off from the pulse of Harlem. But unlike the passive weeping of the epic hero, Bumpy's time in Hades was marked by the same active intelligence that defined his time on the streets. Historical rumors persist that Bumpy played a role in the most famous escape in the prison's history, the 1962 breakout of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. It is said that he used his connections to secure the boat that was to pick them up. Whether true or not, this legend fits the archetype of the wily hero Polytropos who can navigate any trap. In the Odyssey, Odysseus survives the Cyclops and Scylla through cunning. Bumpy surviving Alcatraz and potentially aiding an escape fits the same pattern of outsmarting the captor. However, for Bumpy himself, there was no escape boat. He served his time. This decade of incarceration was a test of endurance, a stoic exercise in surviving a hostile environment, where he had no control over his daily existence. Xenophon's Socrates speaks of the man who can endure cold, heat, and hardship as being fit to rule. Alcatraz was the ultimate testing ground for this endurance. Bumpy had to navigate the racial politics of the federal prison system, maintaining his status among other high-profile criminals without the direct power he wielded on the streets. During this exile, his state in Harlem did not pause. As in the Odyssey, where the suitors took over Odysseus' house and devoured his substance, rival factions and lieutenants maneuvered for control in Bumpy's absence. The Italians, specifically the Genovese family with whom he had treated, tightened their grip. The faithful wife, managing the estate, a role Xenophon assigns to the wife in the estate manager, was played in part by his actual wife Mamie and his loyalists, but without the master's eye. The orderliness of the operation inevitably decayed. This period of exile also served as a transformation. The Bumpy Johnson who entered Alcatraz in 1952 was a kingpin at the height of his physical power. The man who emerged was older, wiser, and perhaps more philosophical. The underworld teaches the hero about mortality and the past. Odysseus meets the ghosts of his past. Bumpy lived among the ghosts of the criminal underworld, men who had been removed from society and forgotten. He saw the ultimate end of the gangster life, isolation and decay. Yet, his legend grew in his absence. Like Barbarossa sleeping in the mountain, the idea of Bumpy Johnson remained a force in Harlem. His eventual release was anticipated as a return of the rightful king. The exile was not just a punishment, It was a hiatus that separated the two phases of his life, the rise to power and the twilight struggle to reclaim it. It was the long, dark night of the soul before the Nostos, the homecoming that would prove to be as fraught with danger as the exile itself. In 1963, Bumpy Johnson was released from Alcatraz and returned to Harlem. This event, his Nostos, was greeted with a parade. The community turned out to welcome him, a testament to the deep, almost feudal loyalty he had cultivated. He was the returning king, the Odysseus stepping back onto the shores of Ithaca. But like the Homeric hero, he found his home changed and his throne threatened. The Harlem of 1963 was not the Harlem of 1952. The civil rights movement was exploding, Malcolm X was preaching on the corners, the drug trade had shifted from a vice to a plague. The suitors, in this case the Genovese crime family and upstart local dealers, had consolidated their power. The Italians, whom he had fought and then treated with, now viewed him as a relic, a vassal whose time had passed. They controlled the supply lines and the politics. This era can be analyzed through the lens of the post-palatial collapse described in archaeology. The old, stable systems of the 1930s and 40s, the palatial power of the organized syndicates, were fracturing. New, chaotic forces were emerging. Bumpy was like a Bronze Age big man, trying to reassert authority in a time of systems collapse. He had to navigate a landscape where the old rules of respect and territory were being rewritten by a younger, more ruthless generation and by the shifting dynamics of racial politics. His return was not a quiet retirement. It was a campaign of reclamation. He found his state in disarray, much as Odysseus found his halls filled with men eating his food and courting his wife. Bumpy's response was not the immediate slaughter of the Odyssey, but a calculated re-engagement. He had to prove he was still the shepherd of the people, the one who could provide protection and order. He resumed his post at 125th Street, holding court, re-establishing his network of spies and enforcers. However, the sea peoples of this new era, the encroaching Italian dominance and the new breed of drug dealers, were formidable. The show Godfather of Harlem depicts a war with the Genovese family, but historical accounts suggest a more complex reality where Bumpy resumed his position but had to constantly maneuver against Italian control. He was no longer the undisputed king. He was a vassal prince fighting for autonomy. This period marks the final tragic phase of his life. The Nostos is rarely a simple happy ending. It is a struggle to fit the hero back into a world that has moved on without him. Bumpy's daily life became a high-wire act of balancing the old ways of the numbers racket with the new, deadly reality of the heroin trade, all while navigating the explosive racial tensions of the 1960s. He was a man out of time, a classical hero in a modern, fracturing world, trying to hold his state, together with the sheer force of his will and reputation. As the 1960s progressed, Bumpy Johnson found himself navigating a Harlem that was rapidly evolving from the structured underworld of the Prohibition era into a volatile crucible of social revolution. His daily life in this twilight period was defined by a complex and often contradictory relationship with one of the most significant figures of the 20th century, Malcolm X. To understand the texture of their interaction, we must look beyond the simplified portrayals of gangster films and examine the historical record through the lens of the Socratic tradition, specifically the relationship between the philosopher and the ambitious statesman. In Xenophon's Memoirs of Socrates, the historian describes how ambitious young men, like Alcibiades and Critias, attached themselves to Socrates not to learn virtue, but to acquire the skills of rhetoric and leadership necessary to dominate the state. While Bumpy Johnson was no Socrates in the moral sense, he occupied a similar position of elder statesman and mentor in the streets, a repository of hard-won wisdom regarding power, survival, and the mechanics of control. Mame Johnson, Bumpy's widow and chronicler, explicitly notes that Bumpy and Malcolm X, then known as Detroit Red, had known each other since the 1940s when Malcolm was a street hustler operating in Harlem. This early connection established a bond of mutual respect that survived Malcolm's transformation into a global icon of black nationalism. In the mid-1960s, as Malcolm broke with the Nation of Islam and found his life in peril, their paths converged again. Bumpy's daily routine during this period involved a careful monitoring of the threats against his old friend. Mamie Johnson recounts that Bumpy, recognizing the severity of the danger Malcolm faced from his former allies, offered him physical protection. This offer was not merely a gesture of friendship. It was a strategic calculation by a man who understood the brutal realities of power vacuums and internecine conflict. However, the dynamic between them mirrors the tragic separation described in Xenophon. Just as Alcibiades eventually turned away from Socrates to pursue his own perilous path, Malcolm X declined Bumpy's offer of armed guards. Mamie records Bumpy's recollection of this refusal. Malcolm stated he did not want men with guns around him, because it would appear as though he were trying to provoke violence. Bumpy's reaction to this: "He shoulda listened to me," echoes the lament of a seasoned general watching a brilliant but idealistic commander march into a trap. Bumpy, the pragmatist who had survived the wars with Dutch Schultz by striking first and negotiating later, understood that moral righteousness offers no shield against an assassin's bullet. This divergence highlights a fundamental tension explored in Xenophon's Conversations of Socrates regarding the nature of the good. Socrates argues that knowledge is the key to virtue, but also that practical knowledge, the art of generalship, the management of the estate, is essential for survival. Bumpy possessed this practical knowledge in abundance. His daily life was a testament to the Socratic definition of the good estate manager, who knows how to utilize both friends and enemies as assets. Malcolm, in Bumpy's view, had failed to account for the enemies column of his ledger. Bumpy's respect for Malcolm was rooted in the recognition of his true goodness, or kalakagathia, a quality Xenophon attributes to those who benefit the state and their friends. Yet Bumpy was also a cynic in the tradition of Diogenes, operating outside the law and viewing the structures of society with a skeptical, often predatory eye. He saw Malcolm's refusal of protection not as nobility, but as a fatal error in the management of his own safety. The relationship was further complicated by Bumpy's awareness of his own toxicity. Historical accounts suggest that Bumpy ultimately cut ties with Malcolm not out of animosity, but out of a protective instinct, realizing that a close association with a notorious gangster would tarnish the spiritual leader's image and credibility. This act of strategic withdrawal is a rare example of a criminal, displaying the Socratic virtue of self-knowledge, knowing what one is and how one affects others. Bumpy understood his role in the social ecosystem of Harlem. He was the outdoor manager, the one who dealt with the dirt and the violence so that others could remain clean. By stepping back, he allowed Malcolm to remain the indoor manager, the intellect and the spiritual guide, untainted by the grime of the underworld. In the aftermath of Malcolm's assassination in 1965, Bumpy was devastated. The loss reinforced his cynical worldview. His daily demeanor became more somber, his movements more calculated. He had seen the truly good man destroyed by the very people he sought to liberate, a narrative arc that parallels the death of Socrates himself, condemned by the city he tried to save. For Bumpy, this confirmed the necessity of his own brutal methods. If the good could be killed so easily, then the bad had to be stronger, smarter, and more ruthless to survive. By the late 1960s, the state of Bumpy Johnson was under siege from multiple fronts: the federal government, the Italian Mafia, and the encroaching infirmities of old age. His daily routine during these final years, specifically from 1966 to 1968, was a masterclass in maintaining authority while navigating a shrinking perimeter. We can analyze his activities through the lens of Xenophon's The Estate Manager, particularly the sections dealing with the inspection of the household and the management of subordinates. Bumpy's day typically began late, a habit acquired from decades of nightlife. He would rise around noon, a time when the work of the estate, the counting of money, the arrangement of meetings, would begin. Despite his age, he maintained a sharp focus on his appearance. Sources confirm he was known for his flashy clothes and love of high fashion, often wearing custom suits ordered from the luxury brand Solka. This attention to dress was not merely vanity, it was a uniform of power. In the classical world, the way a man presented himself was an external signifier of his internal order or cosmos. By dressing the part of the king, Bumpy commanded the respect of the citizens of Harlem. His afternoons were spent holding court. He would frequent specific locations, most notably the layout of 25th Street or the famous Wells restaurant. This practice mirrors the Socratic habit of walking in the Lyceum or the Agora, making oneself visible to the populace. However, unlike Socrates, who questioned men to expose their ignorance, Bumpy questioned them to ensure the smooth operation of his rackets. He had to adjudicate disputes, authorize loans, and sanction independent criminal enterprises. Mamie Johnson writes that, "If you wanted to do anything in Harlem, you'd better stop and see Bumpy because he ran the place." This is the essence of the oikonomos, the estate manager whose permission is required for any resource allocation. The nature of his business had shifted. While he had made his name in the numbers racket, the drug trade had become the dominant economic force in the underworld. Mamie Johnson admits that by 1965, Bumpy had started dabbling in the cocaine trade, believing it to be less destructive than heroin, which he referred to as a sucker drug. This distinction, while self-serving, reveals a man attempting to impose a moral hierarchy on an inherently immoral business. He was managing his livestock, the addicts and dealers, with a cold rationality, seeking profit while attempting to mitigate the worst damages to his own pasture. So Harlem. A significant disruption to this routine occurred in December 1965, when Bumpy staged a sit-down strike at a police station. Frustrated by the relentless surveillance of the police, who were constantly parked outside his home and following his every move, Bumpy marched into the station and refused to leave. This act of civil disobedience is striking when viewed against the backdrop of the civil rights movement. It was a Socratic gesture of defiance against the abuse of state power. In Xenophon's defense, Socrates refuses to bend to the illegal demands of the 30 tyrants or to debase himself before the jury. Similarly, Bumpy refused to accept the harassment as the natural order. He was charged with refusal to leave a police station, but was later acquitted. This incident demonstrates that even in his twilight years, Bumpy possessed the spiritedness, thomos, that Plato and Xenophon identify as the root of courage. He was asserting his right to exist in his own city, challenging the guardians, who had become oppressors. The police surveillance was a constant feature of his daily existence. He lived under the master's eye. But in this case, he was the horse being watched, not the master. He had to assume that his phones were tapped and his movements tracked. This necessitated a life of subterfuge. Conversations about serious business had to happen in hushed tones, in noisy restaurants, or on moving walks. The orderliness that Xenophon praises as the foundation of good management became a matter of survival. Every slip of paper, every phone call, every meeting had to be accounted for. Despite the pressure, Bumpy continued his philanthropic activities, playing the role of the benevolent tyrant. He gave out turkeys at Thanksgiving and paid for children's tuition. This euergetism was a crucial part of his daily labor. By redistributing a portion of his illicit gains, he maintained the loyalty of the community, ensuring that the people saw him not as a predator, but as a provider. This is consistent with the advice given in The Estate Manager, to make subordinates loyal by sharing in the benefits of good fortune. However, the physical toll was mounting. Bumpy suffered from heart problems, a physical manifestation of the stress of his labors. In Xenophon's defense, Socrates speaks of the miseries of old age, the impairment of vision, hearing, and intelligence. Bumpy was facing the decay of his own physical state. He knew that his time was limited. He was under federal indictment again for drug conspiracy. The walls of the law were closing in, much like the Phocæan wall around the Greeks at Troy. His daily routine in 1968 was that of a king waiting for the final siege, inspecting his defenses, shoring up his alliances, and preparing for the inevitable end. The narrative of Bumpy Johnson's life concludes not with a hail of gunfire, as is typical for men of his profession, but with a scene of almost Socratic domesticity and sudden release. The events of July 7, 1968 can be reconstructed with a level of detail that elevates them to the status of a final symposium. It was the early hours of the morning, shortly before 2:00 a.m. Bumpy Johnson, following his nocturnal circadian rhythm, went to Wells' restaurant in Harlem. This establishment was more than a place to eat. It was his megaron, the great hall where the king feasted with his retainers. He was accompanied by intimate friends, including Finley Hoskins and Junie Baird. The presence of these companions is significant. Just as Socrates spent his final hours in the prison surrounded by Credo Phaedo and his closest disciples, Bumpy was surrounded by those who had known him since the beginning. He ordered his favorite meal, a chicken leg, hominy grits, and coffee. This simple, southern meal connects him back to his origins in Charleston, a culinary nostos homecoming performed at the table. In the Odyssey, food is a central marker of civilization and identity. By partaking in this specific meal, Bumpy was reaffirming his roots and his identity as a man of the South living in the North. It was a comfort meal, eaten in a place where he felt secure, a final act of consumption in the state he had managed for 40 years. As the waitress served the food, the collapse occurred. Bumpy clutched his chest and fell over. The scene described by witnesses is one of immediate, chaotic grief. Someone ran down the street to the Rhythm Club to get Junie Baird, his childhood friend. When Baird arrived, he cradled Bumpy in his arms. Witnesses reported that Bumpy briefly opened his eyes, smiled, and then fell into unconsciousness. This smile is a detail of immense mythological weight. In Xenophon's defense, Socrates speaks of death as a release, a state to be welcomed rather than feared, especially when it saves a man from the indignities of senility and decline. Bumpy Johnson was 62 years old. He was facing a likely prison sentence that would have seen him die behind bars, stripped of his power and dignity, The heart attack, or congestive heart failure as it was ruled, was, in a classical sense, a good death, euthanasia. It was quick, it occurred in his own territory, and it spared him the humiliation of another cage. The smile suggests a recognition of this final escape. He had evaded the federal indictment in the only way left to him. There is a legendary anecdote associated with an earlier violent confrontation where Bumpy, after maiming a rival, casually remarked that he had a sudden craving for spaghetti and meatballs. This callousness in the face of violence stands in stark contrast to the peacefulness of his actual death. The man who had lived by the knife did not die by the knife. He died eating the food of his ancestors, held by a friend. He was taken by ambulance to Harlem Hospital, but he was pronounced dead upon arrival. The news rippled through Harlem instantly. The king was dead. The reaction of the community was one of shock and genuine mourning. Unlike the death of a tyrant whose demise is greeted with secret joy, Bumpy's death left a vacuum. He had been the shepherd of the people, in the Homeric sense. A violent protector, yes, but a protector nonetheless. Bumpy Johnson's reflection on his death sums up the sentiment. Bumpy's life may have been a violent and turbulent one, but his death was one that any Harlem sporting man would pay for. Eating fried chicken at Wells' restaurant. Surrounded by childhood friends, it just can't get better than that. This is the epitaph of a man who, despite his crimes, had achieved a form of eudaimonious happiness, flourishing, according to his own code. He died in possession of his freedom, his status, and his friends. In the years following his death, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson underwent a transformation common to figures of great power and ambiguity. He passed from history into myth. This process mirrors the formation of the epic cycle in ancient Greece, where the deeds of heroes were transmitted, embellished, and codified by the oral tradition before being written down. Bumpy became an archetype, a figure upon whom the community projected its fears, its aspirations, and its need for a big man to stand against the encroaching chaos of the outside world. His funeral was a major event, attended by thousands, comparable to the public burial of a statesman or a war hero. He was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, resting among the elite of New York's history, a final assertion of his status. But his true monument was the oral history of Harlem. Stories of his exploits, the prison escape from Alcatraz, the chess games with Lucky Luciano, the standoffs with Dutch Schultz, were told and retold in barbershops and street corners. These stories function like the Cleo's glory of the Homeric heroes, granting him a form of immortality. The contrast between the historical Bumpy and the mythological Bumpy is most evident in his portrayal in media. In films like The Cotton Club, Hoodlum, and American Gangster, and the series Godfather of Harlem, Bumpy is depicted with varying degrees of accuracy. Forrest Whitaker's portrayal in Godfather of Harlem leans heavily into the philosopher, gangster archetype, presenting a man who reads Nietzsche and debates civil rights while dispensing brutal justice. This aligns with the xenophontic ideal of the educated leader, but clashes with the reality of the drug dealer who profited from the addiction of his own people. The media has smoothed over the bumps of his character, creating a black anti-hero who fits the needs of modern narrative. Bumpy Johnson lived until 2009, dying at the age of 94. For over 40 years after his death, she served as the guardian of his memory, much like the widows of Troy or the faithful Penelope. Her book, Harlem Godfather: The Rap on My Husband, serves as the primary corrective to the Hollywood mythos. It provides the domestic perspective, the view from the Icos household that Xenophon valued so highly. She reveals the man who loved reading newspapers, who cared for his family, and who struggled with the contradictions of his life. She acts as the historian, distinguishing between the man she knew and the legend the world created. The legacy of Bumpy Johnson is also defined by the physical mark that gave him his name. The bump on his head, a deformation he carried from childhood, became his epithet. In the classical tradition, physical marks often denote destiny. Odysseus' a scar, Oedipus' swollen feet. Bumpy's deformity marked him as different, dangerous, and destined for a path outside the norm. He owned the name, turning a potential source of shame into a badge of identity. Ultimately, Bumpy Johnson represents the complex interplay between the truly good man and the great man. In the xenophontic sense, he possessed many of the qualities of the good leader he was capable. He managed his estate efficiently, he benefited his friends and harmed his enemies. But he applied these virtues to an enterprise that was fundamentally destructive. He is a tragic figure in the classical sense, a man of immense capability trapped by the circumstances of his birth and the prejudices of his time, forcing him to carve out a kingdom in the shadows. To ask, what did Bumpy Johnson do all day? is to ask how a man maintains dignity and order in a world designed to deny him both. He did it by waking up, dressing like a king, feeding his people, fighting his wars, and in the end, dying on his own terms.